As the end of the legislative session nears, work on a major reform bill continues.
My conversations with legislative leadership leads me to believe there is a path forward, and that we can work this out, and we can get to where we want to go. But it could be a bumpy ride in doing so.
Plus, the housing debate comes to a head, and Vermont may soon join a growing list of states banning cell phones in schools. All that and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks for joining us on Vermont This Week. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It is Friday, May 30th, and joining us on the panel today, Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, Tim McQuiston from Vermont Business Magazine, and joining us remotely today, Lola Duffort from Vermont Public. Thank you all so much for being here. And as usual, there is a lot going on. Lola, we're going to start with you. Things going on at the State House. The one thing we do know is that folks there are going to be burning the midnight oil. We're not sure when adjournment is going to happen, but they're still working on this big education reform bill. Where do things stand with that bill now?
Well, like the governor said, there does seem to be a path, right? And I think a deal on this kind of major and historic education bill is within sight, which is very surprising to me, given how comprehensive this proposal is. But that being said, there is still a long ways to go. There are still a lot of outstanding issues between the House, the Senate, and of course the governor on, candidly, some of the hardest issues on precisely how much money we would give schools under a foundation formula, on the subject of school choice and, which private schools would remain eligible for public funding through a tuition program. And so, we've got a long ways to go, but it does seem like the three sides are inching closer and closer together.
And when you say the three sides, we're talking about the House, the Senate, and the governor?
And the governor, right.
Yeah. Well, last week we were talking about how the Senate had just sort of backtrack on about 4 weeks or, about a month of work, kind of scrap their whole plan and start over again. What has happened in that interim that has got them, as you were saying, inching a little bit closer to an accord here?
I don't know what it is that sort of got them from maybe this all falls apart to we absolutely have to have a deal. The governor has been very clear this entire time that he will not accept the session ending without some sort of education reform, on his desk that he can sign. But of course, he can't really compel the legislature to pass legislation that they don't like. He can bring them back to Montpelier, and he said that he would, but he can't force them to do anything in particular once they're back there. They could just adjourn and go home. But there seems to be a genuine desire to get to yes, and so that is where they're going. I think the Senate, to kind of get over the hurdle that they were at last week, sort of got closer to the House's position, which of course takes them a little bit further away from the governor's position. But somehow all three parties are somehow getting to a middle spot. But there's some really big details that still people have to be convinced of. There is a hope on the House side that, they can keep their formula for their foundation formula, which is what would determine how much schools get. And they're really wedded to this because they think it's scientific and empirically derived and, a formula that they can sort of defend. The Senate and the governor have been more concerned about having a formula that does not inadvertently end up spending more than we are now. And there are kind of certain scenarios in which that might have happened with the House formula. And so a lot of math is going on behind the scenes right now to see if the House's formula can actually land on a number that the Senate and the governor feel comfortable with. And that has a lot to do with whether or not how you determine which schools and which school districts are eligible for extra money because they are in sparse or geographically isolated areas.
Right, right. And so that's why this could go late into the night, and we're just not sure when this is all going to happen. And we have to remind folks, that as you're seeing this here, there is still a lot of that wrangling going on, and things could change a lot. Kevin McCallum, the other thing that's happening, the big bill is the housing infrastructure bill. And there's a lot of that same wrangling that Lola's talking about here, differences between the House and the Senate. What can you tell us about that bill?
That's exactly right. No, some of the same dynamics that Lola just described are going on about the housing infrastructure bill. And this is one that, I've actually been very surprised that it has become as acrimonious and difficult to resolve as it has, because it's kind of a highly technical bill on a very technical housing financing tool. And you would think that if it's minor like that they would be able to bridge their gaps. And actually, it's turning out to be extremely difficult to do that. And it's a little complicated to explain why, but basically it involves taxes. It involves how this program is going to work. And what it does is it allows developers to avail themselves and to use what's called tax increment financing. It's a tool that municipalities have used for decades to help clean up blight in their communities, right? If you had an area that's got a whole bunch of properties that are all dilapidated or problematic, then you pass a district and you borrow a bunch of money and you fix them all up and you build some new roads and clean up the soil and you put a bike path in there, and then when the property values rise over time, you pay back the bonds, right, that you borrowed to do all the work from the increase in the taxes that occur, the property taxes. That's why
we've seen that work
increment
in places like St. Albans, for example.
St. Albans downtown is one, the Burlington waterfront. And so here we are at a moment with a huge housing crisis, right? We don't have that many blighted downtowns in Vermont, but we do have a massive housing crisis. And there's been just an increasing number of people in the state advocating for trying to find a way to use that financing tool to build housing, not just to clean up vacant properties, but to go build housing. And so the idea is, let's expand dramatically the use of that tool to the private market. And that's just giving some lawmakers in the House a significant amount of pause. So they want to restrict the program. They want to keep it modest, pilot level. And the Senate is much more aligned with the governor's big, bold, let's build housing in this state somehow. And if we have to spend a bunch of money, and even if some of it has to come from the ed fund, right, to build the infrastructure needed to have the housing go in, let's do it. And so reconciling those two views has been exceedingly difficult in the last few weeks. They've both got versions of the bill. They both love their versions of the bill, and they both are fighting tooth and nail over the elements of their bill that they think are the best for the voters or for the folks in Vermont.
I mean, getting to compromise is the hard part. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, the education, the funding for years has been a big part of this. What are you going to rob and we're having the problem with property taxes and paying for schools, like Lola was just describing in great detail.
Right.
And now you're going to maybe pull some of that money back and trying to explain how that works.
It's very tricky.
And the towns very often have technically got this wrong. It's a really complicated thing to keep up with.
Yeah, but one of the reasons that they are actually making a lot of progress today is because I think the Senate has been, senators on the conference committee for this bill have been pretty articulate about how that's a bit of a fallacy, the notion that you're really going to be siphoning money from the ed fund. That in reality, what you see over time is that the redevelopment that occurs in a TIF district, as they call them, actually ends up generating money that does more money than there would have been to go into the ed fund if you'd done nothing. So that argument has really created a significant amount of give on the part of the House, and we are starting to see the two sides come together.
And the issue about the housing, just generally, the governor says we need 41,000 more units by 2030, which is just around the corner.
Yeah.
And everyone agrees it's a housing crisis. It's creating a workforce problem. It's creating all these other problems. Yeah. that we just got to do it, right? He's just saying we just got to do it.
You know, that's what's interesting. I think what you were saying, Kevin, is that everybody sort of agrees on the need here, which is housing. We know we're in this housing crisis. Right. It's a matter of how fast we want to get there, how much money we want to spend there. And it sounds like the House is sort of saying, let's not go too quick.
And it's also the type of housing that we're going to build. That's becoming one of the real sticking points, right? Is do we want to open up the doors to any developer to build ski chalets in Stowe or condos for second homeowners? Or do we want to make sure that the money that we're going to be using on a program like this only really goes to build infrastructure that's going to then result in homes that regular Vermonters can afford? So low income people, moderate income, and middle income people. And so that's where the real tension has become. The House is much more of the opinion that if we're going to be spending taxpayer dollars, essentially, to build housing, let's make sure that we build low and moderate income housing. And the Senate is saying, look, we've been spending money to build low and moderate income housing for decades now, and we've only got a few thousand units to show for it. Let's let the free market sort of decide what type of housing would be best. And so that's where the real tension has been. And it has been very tense. There's been some real uncomfortable exchanges in this conference committee like I have not seen before in the State House.
And you can tell us about that? I'm just, go ahead, I want to find out.
Break in for a second. But just build it has actually worked in other places too, where the more you have, the sort of supply and demand thing really works out.
Right, because remember, once you have the units, now you have people moving here, getting a job, buying a car, going out to dinner, putting their kids in school, buying those kids clothes to go skiing. I mean, it's just, you know, the ripple effect of new, and the governor's made this point over and over and over again. So that's starting to.
But that's if you can afford those places. Again,
exactly.
that's part of the problem as well. Also, Kevin McCallum, Senate lawmakers have been advancing a flood recovery bill. And this is something we talked about last week. Pretty important with, you know, flood season upon us pretty soon.
Absolutely, yeah. No, so. The two bills that Lola and I and Tim have just been talking about are the big ones that are taking up all the oxygen in the State House at this juncture, for sure. But along the way, there's all these other bills that are actually making progress, and the flood recovery bill is definitely one of the key bills that's making progress, and that's an important one for a number of reasons, because obviously we have all these flood-impacted communities around the state that haven't been getting these big FEMA buyouts. They haven't been rebuilding. They've been kind of stuck in this place. And so this bill has a number of tools that are meant to help municipalities recover. And each one in and of itself is not super transformative, right? But if you cobble together 6 or 8 or 10 different sort of tools that they can use, there's real optimism that towns are really going to benefit from them. And I'll just mention, you know, one of them is allowing a municipality, a small one, for example, that doesn't have huge reserves in the bank, to borrow some money after a flood so that they don't have to wait for 2 weeks for FEMA to give them a grant so they can then hire someone with excavators to come clean the muck off the middle of Main Street. So normally you'd have to go to the voters and say, we'd like to borrow some money to do this work, and borrowing money is a thing, and you have to be careful about how you do it. So voters have to have a say in that. And typically, this would do away with that. This would allow towns to borrow money without going to the voters. And then there's also a provision that would allow communities to keep more of what's called the local option tax. So these are taxes that little towns pass in order to keep the revenue for themselves instead of having it all go to the state. So like a sales tax, instead of 9%, it would be 1% for the town only. Town gets to keep 70% of that money. They don't
Not all of it.
They don't get to keep 100.
Okay.
They only get to keep 70. That's a 70-30 split. And there's been some discussion about allowing the towns to keep more of that. So now at the moment, or the bill now includes 75% they get to keep, and 25% will go to the state. So that's one of those compromises that I think a lot of communities are happy about.
And this legislation does feel important right now, especially with so much uncertainty about federal funding for FEMA in the future and floods flood mitigation coming from the federal government. We
Absolutely.
just don't know if that's going to be there. Lola, another big bill that a lot of people have been paying attention to, maybe not first and foremost, but this has to do with cell phones in schools. And there is a proposal for having phone-free schools. And do you think this is going to happen?
I think it is. Yes, hasn't quite happened yet. And so, stick an asterisk on that. But it seems like that is going to happen today, that we'll see final passage out of the House. And that as of the 2026-27 school year, so now not the upcoming one, but the one after, there will be a ban on personal devices in schools from arrival to dismissal. So it's not just that, kids would not be allowed to use phones in classrooms, but, at lunch, in the hallway, you would not be allowed to have your phone out for the entire school day. And that's a huge win for advocates. And we've been talking about a lot of really contentious, difficult conversations. This is not one of them. This is tripartisan support. There's been almost no opposition this year. There was some opposition last year. There were some concerns from folks in the school community that this would be really difficult and impractical to enforce. But nationwide, we have seen a stunning number of states now pass these bans. There really is this kind of nationwide momentum and movement behind this phone-free schools.
And some districts in Vermont too, right? Lola, have actually tried this out. I think Harwood is one of them.
And I was going to get to that. And we have had a few schools voluntarily do this year. And educators there have come to lawmakers with kind of glowing testimonials. I talked to one superintendent who, submitted like an unedited list of responses from his teachers when he sent out a survey about how well this had gone. And teachers were like, this has been transformational. This has been amazing. This has been the best thing that we have ever done in this district. And so educators at least seem to really, really love it. Research is kind of still out on whether or not phone bans are, about the efficacy of these interventions, but the research is also early, and testimonials like this really abound. And so, with several schools kind of doing this voluntarily and saying it's been a huge success, plus you've got this momentum nationwide, this happened really quickly and with a lot of unanimity, a lot more than I have seen in this building about any issue in a long time. And so, yeah.
It's nice to have some agreement on something. Yeah.
There's some agreement on something. So it's been really interesting to watch.
And briefly, Lola, do you have any sort of a prediction on when adjournment might actually happen?
No. It'll be either really late tonight or next week or tomorrow morning or a month from now. I don't know. One day we'll get out of here.
I hope I hope you can get some sleep, get some food, all that stuff. We're concerned. Kevin McCallum, I read this really interesting story recently about these underground passages for amphibians. The University of Vermont came out with a study saying that this has been really successful in helping frogs and salamanders and all these little creatures survive, because during their spring migration, they got to get across the roads. There is something you've been writing about, though, for wildlife crossing that maybe is not going to be as successful. What can you tell us about this plan and what's happening with it?
Right. So for years, there's been this study to see whether the state agency of transportation could find places in the network of highways and state and national highways they can punch holes through those highways to allow wildlife to travel back and forth. The wildlife corridors extend all around the state, and when there's an interstate running through it, animals run across the road, get in collisions, and it just is a real problem for the animals and for drivers. So they've been trying to figure out ways that they can create gaps. Usually in Vermont, it's in the form of an undercrossing, where you basically take a culvert and you make it 5 times the size that it needs to be, and now an animal can walk through. Out west, they have these, and they tend to go overcrossings, these really big structures where animals can walk over, even herds of elk or whatever in Canada can go over the highways. We don't have that much of that here, but here we have these undercrossings. There's a few of them. We've experimented with them over the years. They've had mixed success, but there's a new plan to try one in Bolton and it was they had some money from the Biden administration to do a feasibility study and even some engineering drawings, and they were ready to go. And I just spoke to Joe Flynn, Secretary of the Agency of Transportation, yesterday, and he admitted that they were not going to go forward with a major grant application for that project because they realized that even if they could get $25 million from the federal government pot of money that they were eyeing to help fund this project, they didn't have $25 other million for the $50 million project. So they didn't have the other half. And so they felt it was a little irresponsible to move forward with a grant application when they couldn't really, in good conscience, say, oh yeah, we're going to build it if you give us this money. They were basically, they would have had to say, well, give us the money and we'll see if we can fundraise to build, and that wasn't good enough. So they pulled the plug on that grant application. A lot of people are disappointed in the environmental community because it was a key crossing. It was meant to connect, right, the beautiful, massive tracts of forest land between Camel's Hump and Mount Mansfield. And there's a lot of people that are worried that as climate change happens and species can't migrate to new areas, to higher elevations, then they're in big trouble. And so there's a little disappointment out there on that.
Tim McQuiston, there's another project that looks like it's in trouble, and this deals with the Green River Reservoir in the Hyde Park, Morrisville area. What's the situation there? What do folks want to do, and why isn't it looking like it's going to happen?
Well, right now, the Morrisville Water and Light Department, one of these small utilities which are sort of dotted throughout the state, very small, is responsible for the dam there. It's a very small hydro project, and they're out of compliance. Everyone agrees they're out of compliance. They need a relicensing of this thing. They don't want any part of it, in part because the FERC has limited how much water flow can go through the dam. And if you're not getting enough water flow, you're not going to be able to produce electricity. You're not making any money. It's just a millstone around this small company. And so they want the state to take this over. The state really doesn't want to take it over. If you've been to the Green River Reservoir, it is a spectacularly beautiful place.
Great swimming spot. People like to
pristine. No motorized watercraft unless you have one of these electric trolling motors. There are loons there. The easiest thing to do would be to take out the dam, but then you'd lose the reservoir. You'd lose this beautiful benefit to the state park, and. So there's no solution, and the state, and in fact the governor's press conference yesterday was talking about, well, we're looking into whether we want to take it over, and it seems like that's going to be the only logical solution because the little utility can't keep up with especially if it's not producing electricity. It's 800 kilowatts. Like the Townsend Dam on the West River is like 5 megawatts, so even on that scale, on these run-of-the-river type dams, it's actually pretty small. So it's a spectacularly beautiful place. At some point, they're going to have to make a decision because it has to be relicensed or not, or the dam has to be taken out, which I don't think is ever going to happen, frankly.
Because that would not be a good look to drain this very popular
No,
reservoir.
it'd be a PR disaster, first of all.
Okay.
Environmental groups have been calling for the removal of dams, but mostly on a smaller scale. There's hundreds of them around Vermont. You can just walk through the woods and find one of these tiny little dams. But so that's going to be a bigger issue going forward. There's no logical resolution, but I think that the state, which owns the Waterbury Dam at Little River State Park, this would be the second largest dam they would own if they were to take this over, even though it doesn't look that big.
And the state just doesn't want to take it over because of the cost of maintaining it, or is it
the cost of maintaining it, having that responsibility, but I don't think there's any other way to go.
Tim McQuiston, I want to ask you about another story. We've been talking a lot about federal effects that are starting to seep their way down to states like Vermont. Without congressional funding, Vermont Veterans Program faces a potential shutdown. What can you tell us about that?
Well, this is, part of the whole deal about the federal government cutting back on expenses. This is not a big money. We talked about FEMA and the huge impact that could have. This is a couple of $1 million to the state of Vermont to help veterans sort of negotiate. I mean, if you've ever had to deal with Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, then you're a veteran and adding all that complicated bureaucracy to it. This was an organization that would help veterans negotiate, how do I get the benefits through the VA? How to get educational opportunities. There's a lot of benefits that are available to veterans, but just negotiating that. So that would be sort of pulling another federal pullback on helping a certain group.
But the actual program could shut down if this
Yeah,
if this money doesn't come.
And this has happened with other programs too, with other social service programs that have been funded by the federal government. It's just like, well, it doesn't exist anymore. We have to shut it down.
Okay, I appreciate the update on that one. We can end on sort of a positive note here because income-eligible Vermonters are being offered free entrance to state parks. This is, of course, we've been talking a little bit about the state parks. You mentioned the Green River Reservoir, and this is, sort of an opportunity to get more people to come to the state parks, use them, and if you have the income eligibility, I think there are ways that you can show your eligibility for that, and then you can get free entrance to these state parks, which is a really nice thing. It's a pilot program. It's going to start pretty soon, and then folks can, make their way to our beautiful state parks and enjoy them because it's a great thing to do, especially in summertime. Before we head out, I want to, quickly ask the panel here. Do we think that these issues, education reform, the housing bill, are these going to get done pretty soon? Are we looking like this is going to happen? Lola, real quick.
I think the housing bill is definitely going to be buttoned up before the education bill.
Housing first?
There's housing first, and then I think education after. Like I said, I think a deal is going to happen. But I've predicted things on TV before and been wrong, so I'm not going to.
We're not going to hold it to you, I promise. And we're going to have to leave it there for today. Thanks to our panel, Kevin McCallum from 7 Days, Tim McQuiston from Vermont Business Magazine, and joining us remotely today, Lola Duffort from Vermont Public, putting in the midnight oil there. Thank you so much all for watching and listening. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Tune in next week for Vermont This Week. We hope to see you then.